Lynde, I'm so thrilled to have you here. First, I would just love to hear you uh, speak poetically, as you're wont to do, on how you view the role of the dramaturg and what drew you to dramaturgy.
Sure. So traditionally, what I learned when I first started practicing dramaturgy was there was sort of a view in the traditional theater world of the dramaturg as the in-house critic. But as I've practiced over the years, I've determined and really observed that that has changed, and the role of the dramaturg is more about being the in-house audience member and being able to respond organically and honestly to the things that are happening around you and the things that you are tasked with responding to. Of course, there is still the traditional role as a researcher and taking so much of source material to create new work and then building contextual bridges between the source material and the art making, and then of course the art making and the audience receiving the art. And I think building those bridges is also the role of the audience member. It is something that we do for ourselves when we see new work, when we see classic work that is reimagined, when we apply art to our lives. And I find that dramaturgy really does fuel all of that discovery, because it starts from a place of curiosity and a place of really asking questions, not just of the art itself, but of why you are making the art, of how it will serve society. And I think that is something that the artist in general feels a great responsibility towards, is serving society. And I find that most dramaturgy practices today are in service and support of a larger collaborative and collective vision. So I would say that even though it may have started as more of an isolated role where traditionally a dramaturg would come in, do the table work, set up a PowerPoint presentation or some kind of visual and oral presentation, and then usually go away and come back halfway through the process to just check in and to see if the vision is being served, if the intention and all of the pre-intentions of the production team and the creatives are being executed successfully as the audience is receiving them and really starting to talk about how they are affected by the work that they're seeing. So I think that it's important to recognize that while it may have started in sort of that more traditional space, that dramaturgy as a practice is expanding quite a bit, and that devising is a big part of that. And devising ensembles finding benefit to inviting dramaturgs into their processes and exploring how dramaturgy can inform devising ensembles and their creation of new work, I think is something that's new, but is very, very valuable to the American theater field and the global theater field, really.
Well, I'll just share that I always found it a joy to be devising with you, because especially as we've leaned into in the early stages, especially of devising a non-hierarchical approach, meaning that anybody in the room, anyone on the team is invited into that investigative process. So, getting you up and creating content. I would say like more as a in the performer role, what we might think of as a performer in the rehearsal room, that we're all sharing that, is just like a personal delight of mine. And I've always loved that you were willing to like dive into the process that way, and that you didn't just want to stay behind like the table, if we even had a table in rehearsal. Um, are there particular moments that you can touch on in your work with the anthropologists where you felt particularly empowered as a dramaturg, whether as a dramaturg creator or as that outside, well, I don't know if you use the word outside, but I'm thinking like the outside eye, the audience eye, where you felt empowered to like step in and help guide a decision based on your response or responsibility to the audience? That was two questions. Sorry. One is like in the creative process, and one is in that role of bridge maker.
Well, I think for me, building that bridge between the art and the audience came in a lot of really non-traditional ways, which I found extremely liberating, but also like expanding my idea of what audience engagement was. Two instances would be our Reframe Your Reference series around No Man's Land. And that was a moment where I felt really empowered to sort of dive into some very difficult topics with all of our audiences, because we had set up a space where disruption and interruption was built into the show. And
Mhm.
so the idea that I, or we as a group, or I as the facilitator, was interrupting people's frames of reference or perceptions of their place in the world was already supported by the creative work that we had been doing throughout the rehearsal process. And being a part of that rehearsal process, seeing how characters in a script had to navigate a disruptive environment to serve an end,
Mm.
to serve their agenda and their purpose, to make something better, really, which was ultimately what we were trying to do. That felt really powerful. And that felt like something that took a lot of different forms. There were panel discussions. There were also images that we were displaying. We had conversation cards, action cards we sent people out into the world with. That felt like there were a lot of different ways dramaturgy was affecting not just the art making affected the dramaturgy, which affected the audience engagement in a way that I had never observed before in a more traditional creative process. And the other one I will say is during the Sinking Island, around all of the environmental pledges and ways we encouraged other folks to think more consciously about their impacts on the environment. The clothing swap was really impactful. Being able to sort of dig into how each of us as creators was implicated in climate change and rising sea levels felt like a form of personal dramaturgy of my
Oh, yeah.
own life and practices that I had not anticipated in, when you're training to be a dramaturg, you just don't sort of anticipate how a piece of theater or your role in that making of the piece of theater will also affect your daily life. I still don't use plastic straws. So there's something about like that level of awareness that I was awakened to through a dramaturgical process specifically, and devising with a group that I don't believe I would have been able to come to if I was sitting alone doing my research and then presenting it and then going away. Like there's something about integrating your work into your life and your practice daily with a group, with a collective and an ensemble that does make accountability more possible on a very personal level. So I was really struck by how I saw dramaturgy sort of informing
Mm.
so many active and actual changes in people's lives, including my own. I find that even in the storytelling itself, finding ways that we know there is an intention that needs to be served for a specific group of people. I keep going back to Sinking Island, when we knew that was going to be an intergenerational show that would welcome children and young people. The ways in which we talked about tragedy and destruction had to change.
Mm.
The ways in which we decided to tell the story with mask and fabric and light, that was something that was very intentional and based on a group that we wanted to serve, specifically small children. And that was something that I found really came from stepping back and seeing, this is what we have, this is our content. There's a layer missing in the way that we tell this story that has to then speak to an audience that we are not represented by. And I just thought, what a gift to have parents among us in the creative team who would bring their children to watch rehearsals and respond. And yeah, sometimes it did feel like, this is too scary, or this is
Mm.
actually fine. Like we're projecting what is scary and they're fine.
Right.
Like there was so much discovery in just being able to bring in a perspective that we clearly did not have. None of us were small children in the making of this.
I'm thinking too about moments that you've had as a creator in the rehearsal room, that where you've invented something in the devising process that has then become part of the work itself, and what that is like as a non-performer, if you will, to see something that you've created in performance that's not necessarily written words, but action, staging.
I find it incredibly artistically satisfying. As a dramaturg, there have been many instances of me having to explain what I do to people because so little of it is visible in the
Right.
performance of it, or so little of it is perceived. Because there's a very famous dramaturg who, his name is Mark Bly, and he would say of a production that he worked on, "You may not be able to see me, but if you cut that production, it would bleed me." But to be able to create a move, a tableau, something that is visual, even if I am not the one enacting it, but knowing that it came from a creative process that I participated in, or an exploration, composition, then I do have a way of pointing to that thing to my mom in the audience and say, "Look, mom," like the thing that it
That
used to be
moment.
just the program note. Yeah, right.
Right.
But like, look, that thing that she's doing, that tableau, I created that in the room, and now she's creating it for you here. But it started in my brain, and now it lives in a body that isn't mine, which
Yeah.
I could only imagine is very often how playwrights feel, when they
Mhm.
create a character or a moment in a script and they see actors embody it. And I have always, as a dramaturg, been the supporter of that vision, never the creator of it. And so that's something that and though our scripts usually come at the very end of our processes, it's exciting for me to see sort of that transfer of content, how it evolves, and how it starts as one thing, and then someone else jumps in and takes it up and grows it into something new. And
Mhm.
but as the one who saw it from the beginning, you can track that process and see how it became the thing that it is at the end.
Lynde, let's talk about research, source material, cultural artifacts in the creative process. And to reiterate, the Anthropologists has never sought to make documentary theater or verbatim theater. However, we do treat the source material with a great deal of integrity. Um, I'd love to just dig into that a little bit with you and hear your thoughts on how our process of gathering source material, of how we treat it, especially in the early investigative stages, um, and yeah, just how we're thinking about different perspectives through research in the room, in the rehearsal room.
Yeah, I will say it starts with a provocation, and it starts with an idea or an event. And I have often found that even the smallest uh, thread can get pulled and pulled until you are down a very long rabbit hole of research. But even then, once all have been empowered, sort of horizontally speaking, as ensembles are wont to do, once everyone is empowered to bring in the research, the exploration process for me is sort of that macro stepping back and seeing now what's missing, and who hasn't had a story told about them, or what research pieces seem to be more prominent than others, which scholars have been celebrated while others have been ignored. And I'm always struck by how the diversity of ensemble members and what they want to include as research will often show so many different pathways into a story or a narrative. It could live in the visual realm. It could live in the textual realm. It can live in sound. It can, and in painting. And I think that there's so much to the freedom of taking a piece of research and applying it to a tableau, or repurposing it to apply to a modern.
What is the role of dramaturgy in creating anti-racist theater, or creating theater through an anti-racist lens?
I find, and I'll only speak from myself, but I find that the most successful anti-racist and anti-bias practices in dramaturgy come from a generous spirit, but a strong spine. And when one can see an intention, but still recognize an impact and interrupt before harm is done, then dramaturgs are uniquely suited to do just that, because of the ways dramaturgs in general have been tasked with observation and analysis. When you see something and you can analyze its impact and evaluate your own response to why you can perceive the impact, and then articulate that and communicate that to the people who are making the decisions to perpetuate those choices, that is the unique role of the dramaturg. And that is something that dramaturgs have always been tasked with. It has never really taken the coined term of anti-racism in the past. However, that anti-bias work specifically has come from the conversation during that first preview, when a director's choices are having a specific response from the audience that was surprising to them. And then it is the role of the dramaturg to talk to the audience members and to really start to analyze and evaluate their response, to come back to the creatives and say, this, again, being that bridge between the art maker and the audience, and then maybe having to go back to where that bridge between the source material or the text or the piece of art itself and the making of it and the staging of it, where was there a rift or a disconnect or a misunderstanding or a miscommunication that led to the disconnect with the audience, and what are the ways in which we can repair those bridges, I think are all dramaturgical impulses. And I think a lot of them come from, again, a generous spirit, understanding that no one is out to harm, but that when harm is being done intentionally or otherwise, the prevention of its impact or the lessening of it is definitely every artist's individual responsibility, but specifically held by the dramaturg in the way that the dramaturg holds the audience space in the rehearsal room. Like I did start that way. I think it's like the role of the dramaturg is the in-house audience member. And if you are holding the space for an entire group of people like that, a very diverse, hopefully, group of people like that, having a cultural competency, or at least an ability to step back and see a potential for harm, is in my opinion and in my practice, the ways to view dramaturgy and the role of the dramaturg with an anti-racist, anti-bias lens specifically.